Welcome back to the deep dive. Ever look at fireworks, or think about the energy your body uses, or even just a plastic cup on your desk? What brings all these really different things together? Well, it's chemical reactions. And today we're diving deep into stoichiometry. Think of it as the rule book for chemical quantities. Our mission: to give you the essential tools, the sort of chemical calculator you need to measure, count, and predict exactly what's happening in these reactions. We're drawing from great sources like Zumdahl, and DeCoste's chemistry text.
Exactly. Stoichiometry is fundamentally about the how much. Before we get into the why or how fast of reactions, we really need to nail down the quantities involved. And that starts with a pretty basic question. How do you count things you can't even see?
Okay, yeah, counting the invisible. The chapter uses a great analogy, right? The jelly beans. Imagine you're in a candy store. Someone wants 1,000 jelly beans. Counting them one by one. Forget it. It'd take forever. But you could weigh them.
hmm
If they all weighed, say, 5 grams, the 1,000 beans is 5,000 grams. Simple. But what if they're, slightly different?
Yeah, like the example with beans of slightly different masses.
Right. Even then, if you know the average mass, you can just weigh out the total mass you need to get roughly 1,000 beans.
That's precisely the principle we use for atoms. They're way too small to count individually. So we count them by weighing large groups. We find their total mass. And if we know their average mass, we can figure out how many atoms are in that sample. It's a really clever workaround.
So where do those average atomic masses come from? I mean, the chapter mentions pioneers like Dalton, Avogadro. They figured out relative masses from how elements combined, right?
He did. Their work laid the foundation by looking at combining proportions. But for the high precision we need today, the standard shifted in 1961. It's based on carbon-12.
Carbon-12, okay.
Yes, carbon-12 is defined as having a mass of exactly 12 atomic mass units, or U. And we measure these masses and the masses of other atoms relative to it using a device called a mass spectrometer.
The mass.
Right. It essentially weighs individual atoms or molecules by turning them into ions, accelerating them, and seeing how much they bend in a magnetic field. Heavier ions bend less. This lets us determine the relative masses of isotopes, like carbon-13 compared to carbon-12, very, very accurately.
Okay, here's something that always gets me. If the standard is exactly 12 for carbon-12, why is carbon's atomic mass on the periodic table 12.01 U?
That's a fantastic question. It catches a lot of people. It's because the carbon you find in nature isn't pure carbon-12. It's actually a mixture. Mostly carbon-12, yeah, but also some carbon-13 and a tiny trace of carbon-14.
Isotopes, right?
Exactly. So that 12.01 U isn't the mass of any single carbon atom. It's a weighted average based on the natural abundance of those isotopes. For calculations involving bulk amounts of carbon, we use that average value. And this applies to pretty much all elements on the table. They're mixtures of isotopes.
And this isn't just, textbook stuff. The chapter mentions Dr. Anna Unruh Cohen, working on climate policy in the U.S. House. Her chemistry background, understanding these fundamentals, helps her bridge the gap between climate science and policy decisions, like understanding renewable energy tech or methane tracking.
It's a great example of how fundamental chemistry knowledge translates into really impactful real-world applications. Unexpected places sometimes.
Okay, so we have average atomic masses, but atoms are still tiny. We need a bigger unit for practical lab work, right? Like a dozen eggs, but for atoms.
Precisely, and that unit is the mole, spelled M-O-L-E, abbreviated mole. Think of it as the chemist's dozen. A dozen is always 12. A mole is always 6.022 by 1023 units of something.
That number, Avogadro's number.
That's the one. Named in honor of Amedeo Avogadro, it's 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd atoms or molecules or ions, whatever particles you're counting.
And the scale of that number is just mind-blowing. The analogy in the book, a mole of marbles covering the Earth 50 miles deep.
It's immense. It really puts it in perspective.
Yeah. But for tiny atoms, it's actually a manageable amount to work with in a lab.
Exactly. And the definition ties beautifully back to mass. 1 mole is defined as the number of carbon atoms in exactly 12 grams of pure carbon-12. This creates a direct link. The average atomic mass of an element in atomic mass units is numerically the same as the mass of 1 mole of that element in grams.
Oh, okay. So 12.01 U for an average carbon atom means 12.01 grams for a mole of carbon atoms.
You got it. And 4.003 U for helium means 4.003 grams per mole of helium. Different masses, same number of atoms, Avogadro's number of atoms.
That's powerful. It means we can easily jump between mass and grams, which we measure in the lab, and the number of moles, which represents a specific count of atoms.
Absolutely. It allows those calculations like finding the mass of just a few atoms or the huge number of atoms in a simple piece of foil. essential stuff.
Okay, but reactions usually involve compounds, not just single atoms. How does the mole concept work for, say, water, H2O?
Good question. We use the concept of molar mass. It's simply the mass in grams of 1 mole of that substance, the compound. You calculate it by adding up the average atomic masses of all the atoms in the chemical formula.
So for water, H2O would be 2 tons the molar mass of hydrogen plus 1 times the molar mass of oxygen.
Exactly. So roughly 2 times 1.0008 grams per mole for hydrogen, plus about 16.00 grams per mole for oxygen. That gives you about 18.02 grams per mole for water.
Got it. And for ionic compounds like salt and NaCl, they don't form discrete molecules.
Right. For ionic compounds, we technically talk about formula units instead of molecules because they exist as crystal lattices. But the calculation for molar mass is the same. You just sum the masses of the ions in the simplest formula unit. So for calcium carbonate, KCO3, you add the mass of 1 calcium, 1 carbon, and 3 oxygens.
Okay, that makes sense. The bee sting example was wild. Isopentyl acetate, the banana smell compound.
C7H14O2, yeah.
The bee releases only a microgram when it stings, but that tiny amount contains something like 5 times 10 to the 15th molecules.
It's incredible, isn't it? It shows just how many particles are in even minuscule amounts of matter and how molar mass lets us quantify that.
So, we can use formulas and molar mass. But what if you discover something new? How do you find its formula?
Well, you often start by determining its composition, usually as mass percentages of the elements present.
Mass percent.
Yeah.
Like, what percentage of the total mass comes from carbon, what percentage from hydrogen, etc.
Precisely. You calculate it by taking the mass of each element in 1 mole of the compound, dividing by the total molar mass of the compound, and multiplying by 100.
The Carvone example was interesting there. C10H14O. One form smells like caraway, the other like spearmint.
Right. They're isomers, same atoms, different arrangement.
But their mass percentages of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are identical because the formula is the same. The smell is about structure, not just composition.
Exactly. Now, to find the formula of an unknown, a common technique is combustion analysis.
Right, you burn the sample.
You burn a precisely weighed sample in pure oxygen. All the carbon turns into CO2, and all the hydrogen turns into H2O. You carefully collect and weigh the CO2 and H2O produced. From those masses, you can work backwards to find the mass and then the mass percent of carbon and hydrogen in your original unknown sample.
And if there's oxygen in the original compound.
Often you find the oxygen mass by subtracting the calculated masses of carbon and hydrogen from the initial total mass of the sample.
Okay, so you get the mass percents. How does that lead to a formula?
From the mass percents, you can determine the empirical formula. This is the simplest whole number ratio of atoms in the compound.
How do you get that ratio?
You essentially assume you have a 100-gram sample, so the percentages become grams. Convert those grams of each element into moles using their molar masses. Then you divide all the mole values by the smallest mole value you calculated. This should give you, or get you very close to, whole number ratios.
Like the P2O5 example, 43.64% phosphorus, 56.36% oxygen leads to a 2:5 ratio.
Exactly. That's the empirical formula, P2O5.
But that might not be the actual molecular formula.
Correct. The actual molecular formula, which tells you the true number of atoms in each molecule, could be a whole number multiple of the empirical formula. P2O5 is the empirical formula, but the actual compound, phosphorus pentoxide, is P4O10. Its molecular formula is twice the empirical formula.
How do you know if it's P2O5 or P4O10 or P6015?
You need one more piece of information. The molar mass of the actual compound, usually determined experimentally. You compare the molar mass of the empirical formula, P2O5, to the experimentally determined molar mass. If the experimental molar mass is twice the empirical formula mass, then the molecular formula is twice the empirical formula, P4O10.
Got it. It's like finding the simplest ratio first, then scaling it up if needed. I like the chapter's emphasis on conceptual problem solving too, not just plugging numbers into formulas.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the underlying concepts, asking, where am I going? The goal, how do I get there? The steps, the principles, and always, does my answer make sense?
It's like understanding the map, not just memorizing directions.
Precisely. It's the kind of thinking that leads to breakthroughs, like Jennifer Doudna's work on CRISPR, rooted in a deep understanding of chemical principles.
Okay, so we can characterize compounds. Now let's talk reactions, things changing.
Chemical reactions are all about rearranging atoms. Bonds break, new bonds form. But crucially, atoms themselves aren't created or destroyed. They just swap partners, essentially.
The law of conservation of atoms.
Yes, and that law is why we must balance chemical equations. An equation uses chemical formulas to show reactants on the left and products on the right.
Reactants yield products.
Yeah.
Arrow in between.
Right. But the number of each type of atom must be the same on both sides of that arrow.
Take burning methane. CH4 plus O2 gives CO2 plus H2O, unbalanced initially.
Correct. You have 4 hydrogens on the left, but only 2 on the right. And 2 oxygens on the left, but 3 on the right.
So you balance it by putting numbers in front, coefficients.
Exactly. Coefficients multiply the entire formula that follows. You adjust them until atoms balance. For methane combustion, it becomes CH4 plus 2O2, ACO2 plus 2H2O.
And the key rule is never, ever change the little numbers, the subscripts, within a formula.
Absolutely not. Changing a subscript changes the chemical identity. H2O is water. H2O2 is hydrogen peroxide. Very different. You only change coefficients.
How do you approach balancing? Is there a system?
It's often trial and error or balancing by inspection. A good tip is to start with the most complex-looking molecule, the one with many atoms or different types of atoms. Balance the atoms in that molecule first, then move to simpler ones. Often, elements that appear in only one reactant and one product are easier to start with. Leave elements that appear in multiple places, like oxygen in combustion, until last.
And balance equations also often show the physical states, right? Solid, liquid, gas.
Yes, S for solid, L for liquid, G for gas, and AQ for aqueous, meaning dissolved in water. This adds more context.
So the balanced equation is the recipe. It tells you the ingredients and products and, crucially, the proportions.
Exactly. The coefficients give you the relative number of molecules or moles involved. That mole ratio is the key to stoichiometry calculations.
All right. This feels like where it all comes together, using moles, molar mass, and balanced equations to predict amounts.
This is stoichiometry in action, answering questions like, if I start with 10 grams of reactant A, how many grams of product C can I make?
What's the general process for that?
It usually follows a pattern. 1, start with a balanced chemical equation, always. 2, convert the given mass or volume or particles of your starting substance into moles.
Using molar mass, right?
Usually, yes. Grams to moles using molar mass. 3, use the mole ratio from the balanced equation's coefficients to convert moles of your known substance into moles of the substance you want to find out about. 4, convert the moles of your target substance back into the desired units, often grams, using its molar mass.
Mass A, moles. A, moles, B, mass BP. That pathway.
That's the heart of it.
The example of lithium hydroxide in spacecraft seemed critical, removing CO2 exhaled by astronauts. LiOH reacting with CO2 to form Lon2CO3 and H2O. Engineers need stoichiometry to calculate exactly how much LiOH is needed to the mission length and crew size. Too little is dangerous, too much is wasted mass.
Critical calculations. And the antacid example, baking soda versus milk of magnesia.
Sodium bicarbonate versus magnesium hydroxide neutralizing stomach acid, HCl.
Stoichiometry shows magnesium hydroxide neutralizes more acid per gram. That's practical consumer chemistry.
It is. But what happens when you don't mix the reactants in the exact ratio from the balance equation? Which happens, well, almost always in practice.
Ah, yes. You run out of one ingredient before the others.
Exactly. That introduces the concept of the limiting reactant, or sometimes called the limiting region.
Like making sandwiches. If a sandwich needs 2 bread, 3 meat, 1 cheese, and you have 8 bread, 9 meat, 5 cheese.
You can only make 3 sandwiches.
Because you run out of meat first,
Yeah.
even though you have extra bread and cheese. The meat is the limiting ingredient. Perfect analogy. In a chemical reaction, the limiting reactant is the one that gets completely consumed first. It dictates the maximum amount of product you can possibly form. Any other reactants left over are said to be in excess.
How do you figure out which reactant is limiting when you're given starting amounts in grams?
There are a couple of common ways. One way is to take the starting amount in moles of each reactant and calculate how much product each one could theoretically make if it reacted completely. The reactant that produces the smallest amount of product is your limiting reactant.
Okay, so you do the calculation for each reactant as if it were the only limit, and the smallest answer wins.
Basically, yes. That tells you which one runs out first and thus limits the overall reaction yield. Another way is to pick one reactant and calculate how much of the other reactant is needed to react with it completely, then compare that needed amount to the amount you actually have.
I see. So this limiting reactant determines the maximum possible amount of product.
Yes. The amount of product calculated based on the complete consumption of the limiting reactant is called the theoretical yield. It's the maximum you could get under ideal conditions.
Theoretical. meaning not always what you actually get in the lab.
Almost never in reality. Side reactions can happen. The reaction might not go fully to completion, or you might lose some product during purification or transfer. The amount you actually measure in the lab is the actual yield.
And the comparison between those two gives you the efficiency.
Exactly. The percent yield is the actual yield divided by the theoretical yield times 100%. Percent yield, actual yield, theoretical yield by 100%. It's a crucial measure of how efficient a particular reaction or process is, very important in industry.
Makes sense. Maximizing percent yield is key for making chemicals affordably and sustainably. It was also great to see St. Elmo Brady highlighted, the first African-American PhD in chemistry. His detailed quantitative work fits right into this chapter's theme.
Absolutely. His research exemplifies the careful quantitative approach needed to understand chemical behavior, which is what stoichiometry is all about.
So that brings us to the end of our deep dive on Chapter 3, Stoichiometry. We went from counting atoms with jelly beans,
To the power of the mole and molar mass,
figuring out chemical formulas,
balancing the equations that tell the reaction story.
and finally using those balanced equations to calculate exactly how much you can make, the essence of stoichiometry.
You now have the toolkit for quantitative chemistry. Predicting and measuring amounts is fundamental, whether it's in medicine, industry, or environmental science.
Think about it. How can you apply these ideas? Understanding inputs, outputs, limiting factors. It's not just for chemistry labs. Where do you see these principles playing out in your world? Thanks for diving deep with us today. Keep exploring, keep questioning. Until next time.